Today's guest is Maxime Lamoureux-St-Hilaire. He's an archaeologist who studies the classic Maya. Max has just completed his PhD in anthropology at Tulane University in New Orleans. Congratulations, Max. And he has also just completed a junior research fellowship at the Dumbarton Oaks Research Library, which is in Washington, D.C. His research focuses on the political institution of the classic Maya royal court. Max has investigated this topic by excavating the regal palace of La Corona in Guatemala and by reading a ton of comparative literature. Over the years, Max has dug holes looking for old things around Guatemala, Belize, Mexico, Honduras, and Quebec. In this episode, we sit down and discuss his doctoral research on classic Maya royal courts, what foods were eaten during this time period, and the events that these foods were eaten at. We also talk about contemporary Maya foods and what it's like eating at an archaeology base camp. All right, so today we're with Maxime Lamoureux-St-Hilaire, and we're going to be talking about the food of the classic Maya. Welcome, Max.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So can you start off by giving us a bit of a background about who you are, where you're from, and what you do?
Okay, well, so I am from the city of Quebec City in Quebec, and I am an anthropological archaeologist who studies mostly the classic Maya, but also I'm interested in comparative work. And I recently defended my dissertation, so I guess I'm technically now a doctor in anthropology.
Woo.
And that feels pretty good. So my research has been over the years in Belize, Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. Although for the past 7 years, I've been working mostly out of Guatemala. And what I'm interested in general is politics, I guess. So I'm interested in regimes and political structure for the classic Maya and trying to understand how our government organized, but not just the really glamorous theatrical performances that are often perceived as a dominant aspect of governance, but also all the practical aspects of governance and of government, which includes things such as preparing food for the court.
Awesome, thank you. So I kind of want to go back to the idea of the classic Maya. So can you give us a sense of who the classic Maya are and what time period they would have lived in?
Mm-hmm. Well, Maya civilization lasted for maybe 2.5 millennia, from 1000 BC to 1500 AD. The classic period is generally referred to as the classic because of its association with certain aspects of technology and especially writing. So that's when writing becomes very prominent in Maya civilization, and that's when a lot of public writing is done and inscribed on monuments and so forth. And that corresponds roughly to about 280 to 980, more or less. And of course, the Maya civilization was located in what we could term northern Central America. So going from the peninsula of Yucatan in Mexico down to El Salvador and Honduras. So this whole area, including Guatemala and Belize.
Nice. And so in the media a lot, like when you hear about the Maya, you hear terms such as like Maya or Mayan. Is there a time to use one specifically over the other, or is one more appropriate than the other to use?
Well, they're both appropriate, but in different contexts. So Maya is a reference to the people or to their culture, I guess, while Mayan is specifically a reference to Mayan languages. So that is actually, so the concept of the Maya is very vague. Actually, very few Maya people, as we would call them, feel they're Maya themselves, because there's almost 30 different languages spoken to this day, which are part of the Mayan family. So it's a broad term. So yeah, so if you're talking to someone in Highland Chiapas, that's probably going to be a tzotzil or a tzeltal. And if you're in Yucatan, it's going to be Yucatec. If it's in highland Guatemala, well, there's many options, but perhaps they're going to be Kikchi or Quiche or something like that. So Mayan languages are spread around the Maya world, to speak to use the terms right.
Nice. Okay, thanks for clarifying.
You're welcome.
So your research, you said, was focusing on royal sites of the classic Maya, and you tend to move away from that like glamorous component of royalty at the time.
Well, I don't move away from it because I think
Okay.
it's an important part, but I go beyond it.
Go beyond. That's better wording. Yeah, fair. So in moving beyond that sort of idea of the Maya, can you speak to, you kind of touched on it a bit, but can you speak to how you look at it and how this gives you a broader snapshot of life at a Maya palace?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the site where I worked is named La Corona, and it's a relatively small site that's located really in the middle of nowhere in northwest Guatemala. Today, it would take about 8 hours in a pickup truck to get there from the
Wow.
nearest. And so when we're there, we just live in the middle of the jungle. We're like a little mini village with maybe 50 to 100 people, depending how big the project is that year. And what's cool about that site is it's sort of located in an area where you have these rain-fed lakes called civales, which have perennial sources of water, which is really good, obviously, for life. So that's despite being a relatively small site, La Corona had a pretty large palace. Comparable perhaps to the palace of a site like Palenque, which is far larger than La Corona. And to give an idea of scale, it's an acropolis today, which is between 8 and 13 meters tall and covers an area of about 80 meters by 55 meters. So it looks like a small hill if you're looking at it. And it's located in the main plaza of La Corona. And when I was digging there, I didn't dig the whole thing because that would have been insane.
Forever.
But I focused on the north half of that palace, which hadn't really been investigated much. So well, one of the main things that come out of my dissertation work was that the northern section of the palace is subdivided in two complementary halves. There's one that was the royal household, where the king and the royal family would have lived, but also where they would have been hosting receptions, ceremonies, where they would have been receiving tribute and taxes from their vassals and so forth. So it really is the political space within the royal household. While on the other half of the northern part of the palace is what we refer to as an ancillary facilities, where people are preparing food, crafting items, storing things, and there's a sort of a backdoor access there, leading to more such space where perhaps servants and retainers would have been working. So and then between those two halves of the palace, interestingly, there's a control room, an administrative building to control the quality, perhaps, of the things that are flowing from the serving side or the administrative side to the ceremonial side. And alternatively, maybe that was a building for perhaps computing or administering controlling the amount of perhaps taxes and materials and items that were flowing through the royal court and being stored in the storage facilities of the administrative side, if that makes any sense. So yeah, I don't know if that does the trick.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing that. It sounds like really exciting research.
It was fun, yeah.
So I wanted to shift a focus and think more about food during this period. So what were some of the staple foods that were used or eaten across all social dimensions?
Well, yeah, so I mean, there's two things that are very prominent. Of course, there's cultivates like corn, of course, is the big one. Beans, chili peppers, manioc, all of these are important staples of Maya civilization up to this day. In addition to that, of course, is meat, right? So meat was very important. And actually, at La Corona, we have a very with all those sources of water. There's a lot of fauna that comes to drink and to so it's a very good hunting ground.
Okay.
Something that is maybe not well known is that the Maya only really domesticated few animals. For sure, the bees. Honey was very important, and they actually even ate the bees themselves.
Really?
But yeah, but they also probably domesticated turkeys and ducks and stuff like that. But we that's about it. They maybe had some sort of semi-domestication going on with deer. But that's about it. So they had a little domestication in terms of meat. So they were very good hunters, and that would have been a big part of the diet as well, and fishing, of course.
Of course, yeah. Okay. So how do you figure out what sorts of foods people ate back then using archaeology?
Well, yeah, there's several ways. It's a good question. There's several ways to figure that out. Well, I mean, in my own studies, one thing that I was lucky to find were several middens. So middens being a refuse pile or a trash pile. I found actually 7 different middens of different periods, which is really cool. But within those middens, of course, you find the things that they use on a daily basis, like ceramic vessels and stone tools and such things, but also the remains from craft production, like pieces of shell and so forth. But also, of course, you find animal bones. So you find a decent. So within my excavations, I found, I don't know, thousands of animal bones, sometimes with cut marks, sometimes too small to really know. And I am not myself a faunal analyst, but Diana Friedberg, who's the faunal analyst in the La Corona project, she has a PhD in faunal analysis, and she helped me figure out the different types of species that were part of those middens. So the things that seemed to be most prominent were things such as dog. Of course, I should have said that. I'm silly. I forgot dog, because the Maya did domesticate the dogs, of course, and they ate them as well. Then other turkey, also crocodiles and turtles. There's a lot of turtles as well. Deer, peccary, and tapir, and things like that. So you can learn what kind of animals they're eating. But then in addition, what I did is I did soil flotation analyses, where you take a matrix of soil, you take them out of the field, and you have them floated within specific tanks, and then you can actually find carbonized macrobotanical remains such as seeds, and so that's pretty interesting. And another scholar, Clarissa Cagnato, helped me with this. She also has a PhD in anthropology and this kind of study. And with these, we can learn what kind of food, plant-based food they were eating. So, of course, the ones I was referring to before, like corns, are, of course, very common. But you also have some more subtle things that you wouldn't necessarily think about, like sunflower seeds and pits from a small citrus and things like that. So that's pretty cool too.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I just want to back up a little bit. So you said carbonized soil matrix?
You float the soil matrix to recuperate carbonized macrobotanical remains. So the macrobotanical, the macro part makes a reference to things you can basically see with the naked eye, like seeds.
Perfect. Okay.
On the other hand, you can also float it and make and proceed to a different type of analysis with microscopes to try to recuperate microbotanical remains like pollens.
Cool. Okay. Thanks for clarifying for that one. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about feasting. So was feasting a big part of Maya civilization?
Yeah, well, feasting is a poorly defined concept. It's used very liberally by many scholars. But if you just think of feasting as a communal consumption of copious amount of food, often good food, and generally feasting is hosted by a specific group. So if we're thinking about a royal court, yes, I would think that that feasting was a very important way for classic Maya royals to basically attract their political allies to come in the palace on a regular basis. This would have been a moment where perhaps they would have been receiving taxes and such things, but also probably information and sharing it. And basically, they were communicational moments where people gathered and they could exchange all kinds of information because what we have to remember is that in pre-modern times, such as the classic Maya time, it was hard to communicate with people who were living next door. So there was no phone, and therefore, by feasting, you just brought everyone together, and it was a sort of communication technology in some ways. And then you can imagine that within the networks of political networks, there would have been certain expectations for the chief decision makers, the royals, and so forth, to host feasting on a regular basis.
So in terms of, you kind of hinted at like the occasions that would be celebrated or people would come together. Were there differences between like royal events or ceremonies versus more public ceremonies or community events?
So, of course, we can think of, there's a type of feast called diacritical, which is really the kind of feast which is reserved for a small portion of the population. Those are the kinds of feasts I was just referring to. Then that's what I was saying, that feast is a bit of a poorly defined concept. There's a few authors in the Maya authors that have, or students of the Maya that have published on the matter. But the kinds of giant public ceremonies where food would have been served, perhaps more in a fair kind of way, as if going to the fair, perhaps markets and so forth. So those I don't think would really qualify as feast necessarily, but they're definitely massive consumption of food. And now that's not exactly what I study, but one thing that is directly related to these questions, which is something that I studied, is that to feast, you don't only need a place to eat and vessels to serve the food. You also need a place to prepare that food. So within in the palace at La Corona, I found a food preparation area, which is pretty cool. But there's also evidence for larger food preparation areas for those large scale public ceremonies.
So were the larger food preparation areas, were they in the same sort of plaza or the main plaza as the palace, or would it be somewhere a little bit more further off?
Well, that's a good question. So, I mean, the main thing when you want to cook is you need water. So you need to be close to a source of water. So that's the thing. And then so if you have a reservoir, you can expect perhaps to find a food preparation area nearby. But those are pretty complex questions. And one thing you're asking me is how can you know what kind of food the people are eating? Well, I was talking about the different kinds you can find, perhaps during flotation analyses. Well, the other things that I did for my dissertation were geochemical studies, so analyzing the plaster from floors.
Oh, cool.
To try to find trace elements inside those plaster floors, and those can be used to infer what kinds of activities are going around. So the specific type of geochemical analysis that I was doing for my dissertation is called ICP-MS, so Instrumental Coupled Plasma Mass Spectrometry.
Rolls off the tongue.
Yes, it is. And I exported samples of plaster from all over the palace to a lab in the University of South Florida, and they sent me very interesting results with up to 21 different trace elements, and by looking at the differential distribution of trace elements, I identified probably an exterior kitchen area. And by combining that with some micro artifact study, I figured that was probably where they were mostly preparing meat, while it looks like they were preparing plant-based products inside a different building. So it looked like they were sort of preparing meat-based product away from where they were preparing or plant-based things in a sort of a kosher way. I'm joking about that. Also probably identified a meat pantry, and so it's pretty cool. And those are kind of new ideas that I'm floating around with my dissertation research.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because it's not often that you'd really think about earlier civilizations separating those food processes for even like for contamination and stuff like that.
Yeah, but it makes sense because I mean, there's a lot of pests associated with meat,
Mm.
but storage in general is very understudied, just in general in archaeology, but in the Maya especially, and in the Maya world. But one thing that I suspect is that they probably smoked and dried and salted the meat quite a bit, which would have been a way to keep it for an extended period of time.
Certainly. And did they store anything underground, like their meats underground at all, or?
Well, so there's a thing called a chultun, which is sort of an underground cistern that was probably used definitely for storing water, but also perhaps for storing kinds of foods. However, what's complicated is that they always end up turning those into something else towards the end of the life of those chultuns. They'd probably generally use them perhaps as a burial ground, or as a midden, or for they fill them with trash. So it's hard to understand what was their original use.
Oh, I see. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the serving vessels that food would have been served on. So what sorts of things were used to serve food? Was there anything special or unique about serving vessels for the Maya?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, there's always an inferential dimension at trying to understand what the vessels were used for. One thing that I haven't talked at all about, which I should have, is that of course there's extremely fine iconography for the Maya. So we have visual representation made by the Maya of court scenes and so forth, where they're serving food around, or there's even scenes at markets, people buying food at markets and so forth. And we have the name for all these different things because, of course, the Maya had a writing system, and we know, for example, how they called different types of chocolate beverages. And that's another staple I forgot to mention earlier, chocolate, of course.
The fun one.
Yeah, and actually, so to come back to your original question before I veer too far off, the most famous Maya type of vessel are cylindrical vases, which are I don't know, larger than our mugs, but maybe 4 or 5 times as big as one of our big Starbucks mugs.
Mm.
And those were painted with polychrome scenes. And we know from the writing on these that they were almost exclusively used for drinking chocolate.
Oh, nice.
And those were the very fancy pots that would have been probably given to vassals by the royals during certain feasts, and would have been a form of regalia, a token of power that these people could have taken back. So that's a big one. Then we have these open serving vessels, like dishes, for example, that would have been used for tamales and things like that. Then there are, of course, small jars that would have been used perhaps for stews, serving jars, that is, and also some large basins. Those are all technical terms, but of course, and there are some plates are a bit rare, and bowls, and depends. So there's some studies, for example, looking at how there's less and less bowls and more plates towards the end of the Classic Maya period, which suggests that the diet shifted from stew-based meals to more dry meals, including tortillas, which is sort of a late innovation in Classic Maya civilization.
Very neat. So were there differences, and you kind of touched on it, but were there differences between everyday vessels and things that you would have used for like more ceremonial sorts of events?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, naturally, just the good old example of, like, you only take your nice china out when you get special visits.
Yeah.
The rest of the time you eat in your collection of assorted plates that we all have in our cupboards. Or if you're a typical American college student, you probably only eat with styrofoam and plastic.
Very true.
So very sad too. But of course. And the Maya would also have been using coarse vessels on an everyday basis. Something else they could have been using that we don't have, of course, are things like leaves, perhaps, like big leaves, or wooden vessels, which are not well preserved in the archaeological record, so we don't really have those. But yeah, and for example, one thing that is really useful to distinguish from a chronological point of view between the late classic and the terminal classic, which is a transition that happens around 830 AD, is the transition away from fine polychrome vessels, which is a late classic style of fine serving vessels, towards something called fine pasted vessels in the terminal classic. So at this point, the fine serving vessels stopped being with this sort of relatively coarse paste when slipped and covered with these paintings, and became a much finer type of ceramic that almost is porcelain, and that was mostly engraved rather than being painted. And those are called fine orange and fine gray ceramic. And those bowls and vessels made of fine pasted ceramics are also a bit smaller. So it's an interesting, we see changes probably in feasting practices that are associated with this shift in vessels.
Neat. And do you think, or can you speak to, like, with that shift, was there, did it kind of correspond with a shift in the politics of the time, or the success or like relative success of different Maya royalty?
Absolutely. I mean, the terminal classic in general is a moment where the very large hegemonic states of the classic Maya world have collapsed by then. So what you have are smaller, maybe a bit more balkanized, is that term, states. So perhaps more regional in their organization and in their network. So that may, yes, be related to that. And to be frank, you don't see those vessels at every site. Some sites actually don't have them because the governments of those sites collapsed before the advent of this kind of ceramic technology.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about contemporary Maya culture. And you touched on it a bit at the beginning of the interview, but is there still like a big contemporary Maya culture today?
Well, yes, of course, very vast. And as I was saying, we can't really talk of a Maya culture. It's really a regional thing, and it's based on on language groups and on actually the Maya from one town to the next vary a lot in their culture. That's perhaps best documented or best known from the public by things such as textiles. Each village will have its style of weaving, especially in the clothing of women. So they weave entirely different patterns from one town to the next. And that's visible, and especially in the highland Maya world. The lowland Maya is a bit more uniform, and that's where the Yucatec Maya world is. And then in terms of food culture, of course, there's a lot of variation. Some staples are like tamales, which are steamed.
Is it corn husk?
Yeah, it's still corn dumplings, I guess, but they're very large and they're not very sweet like most dumplings. And there's some today they're often filled with some tomatoes and chicken. But if you go to certain areas, well, they'll add olives. If you go to a certain area, they have different types of form, and sometimes they're steamed. In some areas, they're steamed inside corn husk. In other places, they're steamed inside palm leaves. And of course, there's all kinds of flavors and sauces, and there's different kinds of tamales in terms of size. And it's actually, they're very serious about those. It's a big part of the culture. Also, they make a lot of soups. There's some very famous soups in the highlands of Guatemala. Things like caquic and pepian are soup-based sort of stews that are very popular as well. But you don't really see those at all in the lowlands.
And did you, like in your years of going down there and excavating, did you notice any influences of globalization on the types of foods that were offered, or like the variations that were offered? Or not so much?
Yeah, clearly. I mean, the modern Maya people all over the Maya world, of course, are partaking to our great world system. So they have access to a lot of different kinds of food beyond their traditional staples. In fact, it's a lot of the things like chicken, for example, was imported from Europe, of course, but also I mean, in Guatemala, for example, now they use a lot of soy-based meat protein, that like meat substitute called protemas, and that's a thing that is sort of it's just like it tastes like meat, but it's not meat, and those things, and it's really easy to preserve. So that's the kind of thing that we eat on the field quite a bit. But also, and then tortillas are now very, very popular in the Maya world, while those are not. They're more from central Mexico originally. Yeah, so there's a lot of influences from the outside, and when we're in the field on camp, we eat things like spaghetti regularly. So
the hearty food.
yeah, it's not exactly. I mean, the staples though are what we have at each meal. We'll have two things for every meal, and it's beans and tortillas. And to be frank, beans and tortillas are very good together, and they actually are very good, very healthy foods.
Yeah, especially nutritionally together and like in tandem,
Exactly.
that gives you a lot of great nutrients. Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit about what it's like to, work at a base camp for an excavation, and what sorts of, like, what your meals would look like there, like how you would create meals there?
Yeah, well, I mean, for a big camp like the Lacrina project, which I should mention is the project that is co-directed by Marcelo Canuto, who was my advisor at Tulane, and Tomas Barrientos, who's a scholar working out of the Universidad del Valle in Guatemala. He has a PhD from Vanderbilt. And so the directors there create a very cool camp where you have a few large buildings in it, and that are all close to the water sources I was referring to, the civales, those little rain-fed lakes. And there's a kitchen, a large kitchen, or a refectory, if you want to call it that, where yeah, half of that building is stored for food and cooking, and so there's this full kitchen staff. There's a chef,
Oh, wow.
and then but she's a local lady, and there she'll have, like, depending on the years, between 3 and 5 helpers, including one guy who's the guy who is in charge of the corn, because if you're talking to Maya people, there's no way that in the world they're going to eat pre-made tortillas. So, there's a pretty so corn there's a process called nixtamalization, which I imagine you've heard of, which is when you soak the kernels before cooking them in a lime-based solution, which extracts some of the nutrients outside of the corn of the corn kernels, and then after that, it's all the corn is washed and then processed through a mill and made into a masa, which is the name of the paste. And then they make tortillas out of that masa, which are grilled directly on the comal, so a very heavy metal griddle, to use that term. And then every day they cook different meals, and then we would in the morning we'd have eggs every day with beans and tortillas, and then for lunch. Oh, that's an interesting thing in the Latin world. Lunch is definitely the big meal, so that's when you'd have the bigger meal, which is a bit more diverse, and such things. Sometimes we'll have sausage-based soup. And such things, although meat is pretty rare, we only get it once or twice a week. And then for dinner, it would be some simpler meals, a staple being spaghetti or plantain with beans.
Oh, yeah. Plantains are great. That's fair. Okay, so you've given us a lot of your time, so I just wanted to offer you the floor. Are there any sorts of, like, projects or events or things that are happening in your life that you want to let us know about? Not so much.
I mean, I'm really glad I just finished my doctoral research and degree here. Now I'm about to embark on my own project, but in the near future, I'm of course going to participate to a few conferences that I always partake to, including some conferences that are geared a bit towards the general public, including one called Maya at the Playa, which takes place in Florida every September, and one called Maya at the Lago, which takes place in North Carolina. Those are organized by Matt Saunders, who's the director of a small company called Afar, and they're made to engage the general public through lectures and workshops organized by scholars like us. So those are really cool opportunities for people from the general public to come interact and learn from scholars. And those, I can send you the links.
Oh yeah, please do. I'll put them in the episode notes for listeners.
So those conferences are pretty cool. But yeah, the rest, I mean, I have a book coming out, but that's absolutely unrelated to food. So
fair. You can still promote it. That's fine.
Yeah, but that's okay. I think I don't need to do any self-promotion.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your experiences and your work with us.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
That was Dr. Max Lamoureux-St-Hilaire. The link for the AFAR conferences that he spoke about during the interview can be found in our show notes. Thank you for tuning in to Anthro Dish. See you next time.